I'm Will Skidmore. So this is for independent research, and we kind of have free range over what topic we could research. And I love football, so the class started in August. Football season was coming up, so I figured a great topic would be trying to predict NFL quarterback pass yards. So that's the topic I chose. So why did I choose this topic? I've been a fantasy football player for multiple years. I'm not very good at it, but I still play it. It's a lot of fun. And I always wondered, how do these researchers come up with the predictions for these quarterbacks? And so this is just a screenshot of one of many predictions that these researchers come out with each week. So you can see in this column you've got a list of quarterbacks, and it's cut off. There's 32 NFL teams, so there's going to be 32 quarterbacks, but this is just a select few. And then they got the team that they play for and their opponent for that week, and then they've got how many completions they predict they're going to have this week, how many times they think they're going to throw it. This column is really the one that I wanted to focus on for this project, and that's how many yards they're predicting that they're going to throw for. And so then they got touchdowns, how many interceptions they think they're going to throw, and then the rushing column. And that last column is their fantasy points, which is what influenced me to research this topic, because they predict Rodgers there for 300 yards, so he's going to have a pretty good fantasy projection for that week. So some questions prior to my research. Again, how do these researchers come up with these projections? What factors determine or influence them? Like what kind of variables and what type of math is used behind the scenes to determine these projections? I figured it was statistics, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And then where do these experts get their information from? How do they gather this data? What websites they use? So pre-research, to answer those questions, I had first of all, I'd use my knowledge of the National Football League, and then I realized that to determine these projections, there had to be a lot of variables that go into the projections. And so on a weekly basis, I would ask myself, what's going to help or challenge these quarterbacks for this week. And the first thing I came up with was home games. In any professional sport, it's hard to go out and win on the road, so that's going to be a huge factor, or I thought it would be. And so home games would be a big factor in determining quarterback predictions on a given week. Case in point, an away game in Seattle or Denver. And just a couple facts to prove to you that it is very hard to go out on the road and win. Since 2012, Seattle's on the left here. Seattle's won 27 of 32 regular season games, so they don't lose at all in Seattle. And all 4 home playoff games since that time. And then in 2013, in a playoff game, their running back broke off a huge run, and the 12th man, which is what they call their fans in Seattle, their eruption during that run actually triggered a small earthquake. So it's very loud there. It's impossible to communicate. As each team prepares to play in this setting, they blare loud noises throughout the whole week of practice, just in preparation for it. So it's one of the most challenging places to play at. The other one would be Denver, which is on the right there. Their altitude and cold weather is enough to just make it very tough to play at. The cold weather, obviously, towards the end of the season, but the altitude and the cold weather, wears down the body, so that makes it terrifying to play at. And then the Broncos actually have the best record overall since 2012, so they don't lose very often. And their stadium is actually 5,280 feet above sea level, so it's pretty hard to breathe in that stadium. And so home games was just the first one that came to mind. Obviously, there are other variables. And so I realized that the strength of the team's offensive line is going to be crucial, because if the quarterback doesn't have time to throw, he's not going to throw for a ton of yards. And then really this yards per catch is, basically talking about strength of receivers. If they throw the ball downfield, a lot, he's going to have a pretty good amount of yards at the end of the game. And then the opposing defense is also going to be crucial to determining the predictions. again, going back to talk about Seattle and Denver, they've had one of the best defenses in like the past 5 years. And so as I began my research, those were the variables that just kind of I thought of before I started. So I came up with a couple more, and that's gonna help me figure out, it's gonna help me get as close to the actual yardage thrown as possible. So if they predict 300 yards, I wanna get as close to 300 as possible. So I came up with QB rating, and that just pretty much tells us how productive the quarterback is that week. The humidity, if it's gonna rain or not, it's harder to, compile a ton of passing yards if it's pouring down rain. Playbook breakdown is just, do they throw it more than they run? Because if they're 75% run, they're not gonna throw for very many yards either. Week number, that was really just used to help me keep track of my data as I was collecting it. And then temperature, because if it's like around 5 degrees, no receivers want to catch the ball. So it's gonna hurt his hands. So as I started, I just wanted to make sure that this was something that I could do. So I just focused on one quarterback, and that was Aaron Rodgers, quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. It's also the quarterback of my fantasy team, so it was pretty cool to do this as a project. This is actually my data set, not the whole thing, of course. You see you've got Aaron Rodgers and Matt Ryan. That's only 2 of 30 quarterbacks that I have, and it's a huge spreadsheet. Obviously, I could put it on here, but I wanted to show you all a little bit of my data. So we got the quarterback name, pass yards per game. This is from the 2015 season. So again here, look, just threw for 77 yards against Denver last year. 249 in Seattle, that's pretty good. But so then this column is just their opponent for that week, which again just kind of helped me keep track of what week and who I was talking about. Defensive pass yards allowed, pretty simple. The Eagles allowed an average of 267 yards last year. That column's pretty simple. The quarterback rating again shows how productive they were in that game. Offensive line. On some of these variables going in, I didn't know how I was going to be able to measure it. So for offensive line, what I did is in each game there's 5 starting offensive linemen, and what I did is I got the weight for every single one of them, added together, and divided it by 5 to get the average offensive line. So as you can tell, it's never the same number, or pretty much never the same number. So I had to go through weekly and get the starting lineup and then get that number. Humidity, again, whether it's going to rain or not. Home games was measured as a 0 if it was away and 1 if it was a home game. And then yards per catch is pretty much strength of the receiver. Playbook breakdown, what I did for that is I would add pass plays and run plays together to get a total amount of plays, and then divide pass plays by total plays. And then I got that percentage. Week number again was just to kind of help me keep track of what I was doing, and then the temperature. And obviously it gets colder as the season goes on. So that was my data set. So what type of math is used for these projections? Well, it's a lot of statistics, and what I used was multiple regression. And multiple regression has many predictor variables, and these variables produce an output. So using a multiple regression model allows us to include a variety of potentially important variables simultaneously, and it also helps us evaluate the relationship between predictor variables and the outcomes. And there's also some linear algebra going on behind the scenes of these projections, and those include the least squares approximation and orthogonal projections. And what I mean by that, this is just a graph of 2 variables. We've got pass yards per game and QB rating. I have 10 variables. There's no way I could show you all a graph representation of all 10 variables, so I just chose 2. And we've got this least squares line right here, and that's just as close to the line that tries to get as close to as many data points as possible. And for the orthogonal projection, we're trying to orthogonally project all these points onto the line. So that's kind of the linear algebra behind this project. And then so towards the end, I determined what the best model was to use to run a projection. And I used a method called model selection, which eliminates variables from a model that are found to be less important. And even more specifically, I used backward elimination. And that's when you start with a model that includes all your predictor variables. And then you go back through and eliminate them one at a time until you can improve your adjusted R squared. I'll show you the adjusted R squared for my data set after this slide. But adjusted R squared describes the strength of the model and is useful for evaluating which predictors add value to the model. And so, sure enough, the first variable that popped in my head at the beginning was I thought home games would be crucial. I found that my model without home games actually yielded the best adjusted R squared, so maybe that explains why I'm not very good at fantasy football. So then this is how I ran my data and I got my adjusted R squared of 0.4974. And you can see here you've got all your variables. You got O-line, yards per catch, temperature, defensive pass yards, humidity, playbook breakdown, QB rating, week number. Again, without home games because this is my best model. This is actually the formula for multiple regression. This beta knot, that's your intercept. So my intercept is negative 430.07. So you just plug that in there. And then for each variable, you've got a slope. It produces a slope for all your variables. So for O-line, my slope is 0.455. For yards per catch, it's 13.56, all the way to week number, which is negative 1.13. So that was my data. And so then I could actually, once I found the best model, I could actually run a projection for this past week. And this was what I had to type in to run this projection. I went through, so my data set was for 2015, but to actually run this projection, I had to plug in, what I thought the starting offensive lineup was going to be, at the average yards per catch so far this season. The temperature, again, it was around there. The humidity, it actually snowed the whole game, so the humidity should have been 100, but when I plugged this in, it was 81. The defensive pass yards, that'll remain the same. Playbook breakdown, again, that's just your average. Since it snowed the whole game, they ran a lot more. But so when I put this in, our prediction was 287 yards is what we predicted him to throw for. So that was our actual prediction. But this is like our confidence interval. We were 95% sure that he was going to throw between 177 yards or 396 yards. So we were 95% sure it was going to fall in between those two, but our actual prediction was 287 yards. He actually threw for 209 yards, so, again, it's between our low and our upper bounds. So we were just over 77 yards away in our prediction, so, not terrible, but, it was still pretty fun. I'm glad I chose this one. It made it, it was during football season, so it made it more fun. But yeah, this was my prediction for this week, and it was only 77 yards away, so not bad. All right, and that's what I have. Are there any questions?
Wait, do you still teach at South?
Yes.
Okay, I saw you whenever.
Oh, really?
Yes. Because
Okay.
David was talking to me about you.
Oh, really?
That's why I was like, we'll skip her.
Yeah, she was my host teacher.
Yeah, she was my teacher, my math teacher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, she's the best.
yeah, she is. I like her.
Oh, yeah.
So why did the home games not, so why did you have to take it out?
So what I did was this backward elimination. I started with all the variables and ran every possible scenario, eliminating O-line and then yards per catch, and then recording that, deleting O-line and another one. So I did all that, and only deleting home games actually gave me my best model. They had the best adjusted R squared. I would never have thought that
And
that's
that's what
gonna.
you had been using
Yeah.
as kind of your top.
Yeah, that was the first thing that popped in my head was home games. I thought it was gonna be a huge variable, and it ended up not being anything. I guess maybe if I don't know what other way we could have measured it other than away game 0, home game 1. So I mean, maybe if we found another way to enter it, maybe it would.
Makes no sense, but math.
I know. After I saw that, I was like, okay, I don't know anything.
So you have plans to improve your model to beat the system?
Yeah, I'm gonna run a couple more projections.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's really fun.
Yeah.
As a fantasy football player as well. So I'm gonna run some more projections this week. And hopefully I'll get closer. But yeah, the home games, I don't.
Because, I mean, when I played in high school, that affected me.
Yeah.
Because you have like a 4-hour drive somewhere,
Yep.
and you're like, ugh.
You played football in high school?
I guess that could have been another variable is how far away from home your game is. That's it.
I think so, yeah. How different is the climate from
Mhm.
your home?
Right.
Like if you go from Georgia to Denver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Georgia to Oakland or something.
Jeez.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Will.
No problem.
And then it didn't record.
So as far as, do I need to email Dr. Torrance or?